They're measuring the increase in oxidative stress and inflammation as a result of activation of CB1 receptors on endothelial cells. And there's a whole body of evidence there that suggests that activation of CB1 receptors, and I'm very much oversimplifying here, is pro-atherogenic. There are many effects that would lead to or contribute to the development of atherosclerosis. Welcome to High Five with Dr. Igor Grant, Distinguished Professor of Psychiatry and Director of the Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research at UC San Diego. Each episode will take you on a fascinating journey into the evolving world of medicinal cannabis, as Dr. Grant poses 5 thought-provoking questions to his guest, uncovering their personal journey and unique contributions to the field. Now, here's your host, Dr. Igor Grant.
Hello, and welcome again. Today, I'll be speaking with Dr. Jamie Corroon, who is a naturopathic doctor, assistant project scientist at the Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research here at the University of California, San Diego. He recently completed a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship in cardiovascular disease epidemiology, where he focused on the impact of cannabis use on cardiovascular health. I served as one of Dr. Corroon's mentors during his fellowship, and I'm pleased to welcome him to the program to discuss his work. Welcome, Dr. Corroon.
Thank you, Dr. Grant. Good to be here.
So there's been a lot of interest in the popular media, certainly, about whether cannabis poses cardiovascular risk. We've had case reports of people showing up in the ER with heart attacks after using cannabis, and that's, I think, introduced at least some worry to the public. We want just the facts. And so tell us about how you got interested in this topic, and then I'll ask you more about what you did.
Yeah, so I have been interested in medicinal plants as a naturopathic doctor and have training in the pharmacology and toxicity and safety of plant-derived medicines. And cannabis is one of those medicines that has this very checkered past and a lot of potential. And the perceptions of harms and the therapeutic value are evolving over time. And the answers to these questions are very important. So I am drawn to try to answer some of the more important clinical and public health questions related to cannabis. I shifted my focus towards cardiovascular disease when I started the fellowship at UCSD in the Department of Family Medicine a few years ago. And cardiovascular disease, as you know, is one of the most important diseases in the world, and it has a huge impact in terms of morbidity and mortality. Understanding the impact of cannabis use on the cardiovascular system is very, very important, especially as more people are gaining access to cannabis and cannabis-derived products.
Right. So it's certainly a public health concern and a place where we want to sort out facts from fancies. So how did you approach this question?
Well, there's a lot of research that looks at the acute effects of cannabis use on the function of the heart. Does it increase heart rate? The answer is yes. Does it increase the strength with which the heart contracts? The answer is yes. Does it increase blood pressure or does it decrease blood pressure? The answer is it kind of depends on the individual. In many people, use does increase blood pressure. In others, it actually lowers blood pressure, and hypotension is a risk. But more than that, we were wanting to focus on the long-term use. So not just bringing someone into a lab and having them hooked up to all these sensors and having them smoke a joint and measure what's actually happening with the heart. We wanted to know what was happening if someone were to smoke cannabis every day for 35 years. What would the impact on the function of the heart be? Would they be at greater risk for atherosclerosis, for hypertension, etc.? So most of our work has been focused on hypertension, but we've also looked at atherosclerosis and we also looked at heart attack. And the way that these studies are done that's different than those acute studies is now we're trying to track people over time, over decades if possible. and we're relying on them to report to us how much cannabis they're using, what method they're using, how frequently they're using it. And so as soon as you move from an acute use setting where you can control all of the variables into a more chronic or regular use setting where you're relying on users to give you all of the information, there's some degree of uncertainty about whether the information that you're getting is quality information. And so one of the limitations in this type of observational research is that you're relying on self-report from the users.
Okay. Now, how do you actually do the work? I mean, are you having thousands of people troop through your lab, or how do you do this?
Well, there are NIH and other federally funded and non-federally funded cohort studies where a group of individuals with predefined characteristics are enrolled at a single point in time that we call baseline, and then they are followed over time. And those could be initially maybe once every year, then every 2 years, then every 5 years, maybe every 10 years. And at each of those time points, they are administered a series of questionnaires, and a variety of objective measures are taken, like blood pressure, like weight, etc. And then you have these repeated measures over time on the same individuals so that you can track them. And there are studies like the NHANES, which is a data set that we use. This is the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, which is funded and managed by the CDC, which is the largest health survey in the US and is designed to create a nationally representative sample of Americans so that the conclusions that you draw from your sample could be extrapolated to the broader US population.
So you dug deep into these nationally available data, I take it, right? How big is this data set that you used?
Well, we use, I think, 3 different data sets. The NHANES sample that we used was over a 10-year period, so a decade's worth of data, 2009 to 2018. And we looked at that as one cross section. So we looked at a decade in time, and it was about 10,000 individuals. And we looked at this data set both in terms of heart attack as well as blood pressure and hypertension.
All right. And so what did you find?
Well, unlike a lot of the research that's out there that uses variables like, have you ever used cannabis? Yes or no. And then they describe the findings as it relates to people who have ever used it, or other questions that say, have you used it in the past month? Yes or no. We, as I mentioned, we wanted to look at this pattern of regular use. So our exposure, so to speak, was individuals who self-reported a history of regular cannabis use, which was defined as using it, and in this case, smoking it at least monthly for at least a year. And so that was the definition of regular use or regular cannabis smoking in the NHANES studies that we did. We also looked at the duration of that use, and then we looked at the recency of it. So if, for example, smoking cannabis was contributing to hypertension or even causing hypertension, if someone used it for 15 years and then stopped using it for 10 years, would there be a repair process such that if the risk was there initially, it was no longer there because the body had healed itself? Or was the damage irreparable? So we wanted to look at those who were using it recently with a history of regular use, and then those who were not using it recently because they had discontinued their regular use. So I know this is kind of a long, complicated answer to your question, but basically what we found for heart attack was that those who reported a history of regular use had no greater risk of a heart attack than those who reported never using it, and as compared to those who reported using it, but not on a regular basis. And the same was true for the duration. What we found was that people who used it for, or reported using it for more than 10 years had no greater risk or prevalence of heart attack than those who had never used it, or as compared to those who had used it for 5 years or less.
So that's really very interesting and runs a bit counter to at least some popular thoughts that using cannabis can cause a heart attack, right?
Yes, definitely. I mean, there are physiological reasons why cannabis should be a risk factor for heart attack, given the impact of cannabinoids on the endocannabinoid system as it relates to the nervous system and the cardiovascular system. The acute effects of exposure to THC are that it increases the heart rate and it increases the cardiac contractility. So if you're smoking it, it also exposes the individual to carbon monoxide along with a variety of other byproducts of combustion. But carbon monoxide in particular has a higher affinity for hemoglobin, which is the compound in our blood that carries oxygen. So in an environment where an individual might have advanced atherosclerosis and they've smoked cannabis, and as a result, the oxygen capacity of the blood is diminished because there's more carbon monoxide bound to hemoglobin, then this individual would be at risk for a heart attack, which is a lack of oxygen to the cardiac muscle itself. And in this situation, the heart is beating fast, it's beating hard because of the THC, and now there's not as much oxygen around. And so in that setting, there's clearly a possibility of a risk. I would point out that the impact on the heart in that situation mediated by THC is probably no different than that same individual performing a physical activity like running up a stairway or any other thing like nicotine, for example, that would also have that same impact on the heart. So it's not totally unique to cannabis. It's just that the strain on the heart is a little bit greater and the oxygen capacity of the blood is a little bit diminished.
Okay, so overall, statistically speaking, you found no relationship between people who used cannabis on a somewhat regular basis, it sounds like, and having a history of heart attack. Did you have any sample that were super heavy users? Because that's I guess, a question that might come up.
Yeah, we looked at everything, and that is the right approach. You want to try and find the subgroup with the greatest exposure and compare them to everyone down the line, especially to those who report never using it. Those people get fewer and fewer, and so the size of your data set is really important. And we did look at those sort of daily users, as we called them, and there was no greater risk there, but also it was a smaller set. And so we can't really be too convinced that there is no risk there. And I should mention there are other studies like ours that have shown an increased risk. Our study did not. And so, our study is not the definitive answer, of course. This is a body of research that's evolving over time. And there are limitations to these cross-sectional studies that are very important, specifically as it relates to cause and effect.
Sure. Okay. Now, you had mentioned also atherosclerosis, calcification of the arteries. Have you done some work in that area? And is there any relationship between regular cannabis use and hardening of the arteries?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of mechanistic preclinical science that seeks to explore the impact of the endocannabinoid system and specifically CB1 and CB2 receptors on the heart and the blood vessel tissues themselves. So endothelial cells and cardiac myocytes. And there are studies where they're measuring the increase in oxidative stress and inflammation as a result of activation of CB1 receptors on endothelial cells. And there's a whole body of evidence there that suggests that activation of CB1 receptors, and I'm very much oversimplifying here, is pro-atherogenic. There are many effects that would lead to or contribute to the development of atherosclerosis. And then on the flip side, the activation of the CB2 receptor seems to be protective. it's reducing inflammation, it's reducing oxidative stress, it's reducing the ability of fibroblasts to secrete fibrin, which might lead to hardening and vascular remodeling, which would prevent the blood vessels from efficiently dilating and contracting. So mechanistically, it looks like the CB1 receptor is a little more deleterious in terms of its harms, and the CB2 receptor is a little bit more protective. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, so let's just unpack that a little bit for the audience in case they're not all into CB1 and CB2 receptors. Basically, receptors are like a lock and key mechanism. A lot of body functions relate to chemicals coming in, fitting themselves exactly into a receptor, and then causing an effect on whatever the organ is or cell is that they're in. I mean, that's just a simple way to look at it. And it turns out that our bodies do have two types of these receptors that interact with THC and some of the other cannabinoids, and they're called CB1 and CB2, and they have different effects, as Dr. Corroon mentioned. And so in this case, it sounds like a zero-sum game a little bit, that activating one part of the system may be not good, but then activating the other part may actually neutralize it to some degree. Would that be a fair way to say it?
I think so. I mean, obviously, we're simplifying in the effort to educate and explain. I would also note that with repeated exposure, these receptors tend to downregulate, and this is the mechanism behind tolerance. So people have probably heard of tolerance, developing a relationship with a substance where in order to achieve the same effect, you must increase the dose or the frequency of the substance. And that's often a result of these receptors being downregulated when there's more exposure to, say, THC in this situation. And so perhaps that's one way to explain why these regular users in our studies haven't exhibited greater risk for these cardiovascular outcomes. Perhaps it's due to downregulation of the CB1 receptor, which we're calling sort of the deleterious or harmful receptor. On the flip side, the CB2 receptor that we're calling the protective receptor or the immune receptor, the immune system receptor, this receptor gets upregulated in the presence of inflammation. So this is just our idea of potentially why we aren't finding the harms that we expected to find. I mean, we're talking about people inhaling a hot cloud of chemicals on a regular basis over the course of 30 or 35 years. It would be difficult to imagine why that wouldn't show up in terms of cardiovascular disease, especially given what we know about tobacco cigarette smoke. So perhaps the endocannabinoid system here and the up and down regulation of these two types of receptors is a potential explanation.
So what did your study on atherosclerosis find?
Yeah, so we looked at calcified plaques. So atherosclerosis, when it's advanced, these plaques can become calcified. In the beginning, mostly they're just lipids. They're full of LDL cholesterol and this type of white blood cell macrophages. But then as it becomes more dense and evolved over time, calcification occurs, and these calcified plaques will appear on a CT scan. And so we looked at advanced atherosclerosis in the carotid arteries, and we also wanted to look at stroke. And this data set, we used the multi-ethnic study of atherosclerosis, the MESA study, which is a well-known NIH-funded cardiovascular disease cohort study. And we wanted to look at stroke, but there weren't enough strokes or enough events for us to do the analysis. We looked at the group that reported a history of regular cannabis smoking and the group that did not report a history of regular cannabis smoking. There were fewer strokes. The portion of those in the exposed group for stroke was lower, but there weren't enough events to analyze strokes. Then we looked at the presence or absence of calcified plaque. And then in the subset of individuals that did have calcified plaque, we looked at the extent of the plaque. So first, we looked at the left carotid, we looked at the right carotid, and then we combined them and said, in either carotid artery. Is there calcified plaque, yes or no? And those who reported a history of regular cannabis smoking had no greater prevalence of calcified plaque in the left, right, or either carotid artery as compared to those without a history of regular cannabis smoking. And then we did that same analysis for the duration, and we broke it up into 0 to 5 years, 5 to 10 years, and greater than 10 years. And we saw the same thing. So individuals with greater than 10 years of regular cannabis smoking had no greater prevalence of calcified plaque than those with no history of regular cannabis smoking.
So you also have done work on hypertension. And the reason hypertension is important, of course, besides the fact that it's very prevalent, is it's also one of the causes of atherosclerosis and, of course, heart disease as well. What did you find in terms of hypertension?
Yeah, so we looked at that in 3 different data sets: NHANES, MESA, which we just discussed, and then the Cardia study. And in all 3 of those data sets, we didn't find any differences in systolic or diastolic or pulse pressure across these groups, nor did we find any differences in the prevalence of hypertension or the incidence of hypertension. The NHANES study and the MESA study were cross-sectional studies, and the Cardia study was a longitudinal study over 35 years, which, as you know, has more rigorous scientific methods and is a better study design for really answering this question. And even in that study, using advanced statistical methods, we didn't find any increased incidence in hypertension risk.
Okay, so you covered a lot of ground in your work, from heart attack to atherosclerosis to hypertension. What are the important takeaways here?
Yeah, I think despite these findings, I still think that inhaling a hot cloud of chemicals is a bad idea. There's clearly respiratory injury that occurs, including with aerosols or vapors from dabbing or from vape cartridges, etc. So I don't think that's a healthy practice. I don't think anyone really should be doing that, despite our findings. So if people are going to be using cannabis, I think it's probably safer to be using it orally or topically. And then as far as what needs to be done, we need to keep doing what we're doing with better methods. And because of the Schedule I status of cannabis, because of its reputation as being so harmful, even though this reputation was not deserved, we still don't really have the data that we need to answer these questions. So Cardia is a very unique cohort study because over that 35-year period, there were 10 exam dates. And in all 10 of them, the same series of cannabis-related questions was asked, which is really rare. So the other studies, including MESA, they only asked about cannabis use in 2016 and 2018, even though the study enrolled their subjects in 2000 and 2002, or between 2000 and 2002. So if we want to answer these questions over time, we need the prevailing cohort studies to be asking the right questions. We need to be knowing what method these participants are using. Are they smoking it? Are they ingesting it? We need to know if there are other cannabinoids involved. Is there a potential that there could be a reduced risk because there's CBD in the products that people are using? And so there's just a lot more questions that need to be answered, and we need to be updating the questionnaires used in these studies so that in 5, 10, 15 years, we have good data.
Any final thoughts?
There's so much misinformation and there's a lot of fear. And I think the jury is still out, and the precautionary principle is very important. Despite the fact that we haven't found risk, it doesn't mean it's not there. And many other investigators have published studies that demonstrate there is risk. And so go forward with caution and try to avoid inhaling if possible, is what I would say.
So thank you, Dr. Corroon. I'm Igor Grant, and we have been talking with Jamie Corroon from the Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research.
If you liked this podcast, Please subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. For more information on the Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research at UC San Diego, please find us on social media at CMCR_UCSD on Twitter or X, Instagram, and other social media platforms. Or visit our website at cmcr.ucsd.edu. Thanks for listening.